77 days of relentless artillery fire, monsoon rains, and the constant, suffocating dread of an enemy that seemed to materialize from the very mist of the jungle. Imagine sitting in a trench carved into red clay, the air vibrating so violently from incoming rockets that your teeth rattle, knowing that tens of thousands of hardened enemy troops are digging their way toward your perimeter, yard by bloody yard. This was not the Alamo, and it was not Bastogne, though the men who fought there shared the same desperate bloodline of surrounded defenders holding the line against impossible odds. This was January 1968, on a remote, fog-shrouded plateau in the northwest corner of South Vietnam, a place that would soon become the obsession of the American president, the focal point of the global media, and a meat grinder for two opposing armies. We are talking about the Battle of Khe Sanh, a siege that begs a historical question that strategists still argue over in war colleges today. Was this America's Dien Bien Phu, a catastrophic blunder that almost saw an entire Marine regiment wiped out, or was it a brilliant, calculated trap set by the United States military to annihilate the North Vietnamese Army using the greatest concentration of aerial firepower the world had ever seen? Before we strip away the myths and dissect the raw tactical reality of this legendary siege, I want to welcome you back to the channel. If you appreciate deep, uncompromising military analysis that respects the history and the men who made it, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment below with your thoughts on whether air power alone can hold ground. Your support keeps this channel firing on all cylinders, and we have a massive amount of ground to cover today. To understand the nightmare of Khe Sanh, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic real estate it occupied, because in war, geography is destiny. Khe Sanh was located in the Hoang Hoa district of Quang Tri province, a mere 14 miles south of the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, which separated North and South Vietnam. Even more critically, it sat just 6 miles east of the Laotian border. The base was anchored along Route 9, an old French colonial road that snaked its way from the coastal city of Dong Ha, straight west through the rugged Annamite Mountains, and into Laos. Why did this matter? Because Laos was the sanctuary, the geographical shield behind which the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, operated the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail was not a single dirt path, but a massive, highly sophisticated logistical nervous system of roads, bypasses, and underground depots that fed men and munitions into South Vietnam. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, looked at his maps and saw Khe Sanh as a cork in the bottle. He believed that by holding this forward combat base, he could anchor the western flank of the so-called McNamara Line, a series of strongpoints and electronic sensors designed to stop North Vietnamese infiltration. Furthermore, Westmoreland envisioned Khe Sanh as a vital jumping-off point for a future massive Allied invasion into Laos to physically cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a bold offensive that he desperately wanted to launch if the politicians in Washington would ever give him the green light. From a purely aggressive standpoint, putting a combat base right on the enemy's doorstep makes perfect sense. But why would you place your elite infantry in a static defense, tied to a single airstrip in a region surrounded by high ground held by the enemy? If you asked a French veteran of 1954 that exact question, he would probably offer you a bitter laugh, light a cigarette, and advise you to write your will. 14 years prior, the French military attempted a very similar strategy at a place called Dien Bien Phu. The French High Command, led by General Henri Navarre, deliberately placed a garrison of paratroopers and foreign legionnaires in a remote valley near the Laotian border. Navarre's logic was arrogant but straightforward. He wanted to lure the elusive Viet Minh into a set-piece battle. The French believed their superior artillery and air support would crush the lightly armed insurgents. Instead, the Viet Minh commander, General Nguyen Giap, achieved the impossible. He mobilized tens of thousands of peasants to drag heavy artillery pieces up the jungle mountainsides by hand, camouflaged them perfectly on the forward slopes looking down into the French valley, and systematically choked off the French airstrip, starving the garrison of supplies until they were overrun. It was a humiliating defeat that ended the French Empire in Indochina. Now, in late 1967, General Giap was the Minister of Defense for North Vietnam, and he was looking at Khe Sanh. Giap recognized the profound psychological scar that Dien Bien Phu had left on the Western world, and particularly on the American political psyche. President Lyndon B. Johnson was so terrified of Khe Sanh becoming an American Dien Bien Phu that he literally had a sand table model of the battlefield built in the White House basement, and he made his Joint Chiefs of Staff sign a piece of paper guaranteeing that the base would not fall. But was Giap actually trying to overrun Khe Sanh? Or was he playing a much larger, more deceptive game? By moving tens of thousands of regular NVA troops toward the border, Giap successfully forced Westmoreland to divert massive amounts of American combat power, air assets, and logistical support away from the populated coastal cities and the southern provinces. This massive diversion was the vital prerequisite for the impending Tet Offensive, a nationwide surprise attack designed to shatter the South Vietnamese government. Was Westmoreland playing chess while Giap was playing Go, or was it the other way around? Let us look at the men and the machines that were moving into position for this apocalyptic showdown, starting with the defenders. The core of the defense fell to the 26th Marine Regiment, commanded by Colonel David E. Lowndes. Lowndes was a veteran of Iwo Jima, a man who understood the brutal mathematics of attrition. He was soon reinforced by other elements, including the legendary 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, a unit that had seen so much vicious combat they were grimly nicknamed the Walking Dead. Eventually, the garrison would swell to roughly 6,000 men, including a highly capable contingent of South Vietnamese troops, the 37th ARVN Ranger Battalion, who would be assigned to hold a highly exposed sector of the eastern perimeter. The United States Marine Corps is fundamentally an amphibious shock force, designed for mobility, aggression, and taking the fight to the enemy. tying them down to a static fortified plateau, ran completely counter to Marine doctrine. The Marine brass, including General Victor Krulak, vehemently opposed the defense of Khe Sanh, arguing that it was an isolated outpost of no real tactical value that simply offered the enemy a fixed target. But Westmoreland overruled them. Westmoreland was an artilleryman by trade, and he did not see Khe Sanh as a defensive liability. He saw it as the ultimate killing zone. The American strategy relied on a doctrine of overwhelming, unprecedented firepower. Westmoreland initiated Operation Niagara, named because he intended to unleash a waterfall of bombs and artillery shells upon the North Vietnamese. The crown jewel of this operation was the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. Originally designed to carry nuclear weapons into Soviet airspace, the B-52D models used in Vietnam were modified for conventional carpet bombing. A single B-52 could carry an astonishing payload of over 70,000 pounds of bombs, typically a mix of 500 and 750-pound iron bombs. Flying in cells of 3, from bases in Guam and Thailand. At altitudes of 30,000 feet, these massive bombers were completely invisible and inaudible to the troops on the ground until the world suddenly erupted in a cataclysm of fire and concussive overpressure. These strikes, known as arc lights, could obliterate an area a mile long and half a mile wide, turning triple canopy jungle into a lunar landscape of craters and splintered wood. Supporting the air armada was a formidable array of ground artillery. Inside the Khe Sanh combat base itself, the Marines had batteries of 105mm and 155mm howitzers, capable of firing high explosive, white phosphorus, and deadly flechette rounds, which acted like giant flying shotguns against massed infantry assaults. Furthermore, 15 miles to the east, at a firebase called Camp Carroll, the Americans positioned their heavy hitters, the M107 self-propelled 175mm guns. These massive cannons, boasting a barrel over 30 feet long, could hurl a 147-pound projectile over 20 miles. Camp Carroll, nicknamed the Rock of Gibraltar, was meant to provide counter-battery fire against the heavy guns the NVA were bringing to the fight. And the NVA were indeed bringing heavy guns, showcasing a level of conventional military capability that shocked American intelligence. The forces converging on Khe Sanh were not pajama-wearing Viet Cong guerrillas. This was the regular North Vietnamese Army. The primary units assigned to the siege were the 304th and the 325th Sea Divisions, later joined by elements of the 320th and 324th Divisions. We are talking about 20 to 30,000 highly disciplined, well-equipped, and fiercely motivated light infantrymen. The 304th Division, in particular, carried a terrifying pedigree. They were veterans of Dien Bien Phu. They had literally written the book on how to strangle a Western garrison, and now they were here to apply those bloody lessons against the Americans. The North Vietnamese doctrine for this battle was heavily influenced by Soviet and Chinese siege tactics. It relied on 3 pillars: heavy artillery, bombardment, strangulation of the enemy's logistical supply lines, and the agonizingly slow, methodical digging of trench networks that zigzagged ever closer to the American wire. To achieve the first pillar, the NVA deployed the Soviet-designed M46 130mm towed field gun. This weapon was an absolute masterpiece of mid-century artillery design. It had a maximum range of over 17 miles, which outranged the standard American 155mm howitzers. The NVA ingeniously positioned these heavy guns on the reverse slopes of the Kho Rock Mountains, just across the border in Laos. They would roll the guns out of caves, fire their salvos into the Marine base, and then quickly roll them back into the solid rock before American aircraft or counter-battery fire from Camp Carroll could respond. The M46 could reach out and touch the Marines from a neighboring country, comfortably sitting in neutral Laos, which in the context of the Vietnam War was about as neutral as a bar fight. Along with the 130mm guns, the NVA brought 152mm howitzers, deadly 122mm rockets, and heavily armoured Soviet PT-76 amphibious light tanks, a weapon system the Americans had no idea was operating in this sector. The presence of armour meant the NVA were not just planning to harass the base. They were planning to breach the wire and crush the defenders under steel treads. But the true marvel of the North Vietnamese war machine was not their Soviet hardware. It was their logistics. How do you supply a 30,000-man army with thousands of artillery shells, rockets, food and medical supplies in the middle of a dense, mountainous jungle? The American umbilical cord was the Lockheed C-130 Hercules, a massive 4-engine turboprop aircraft that could haul up to 45,000 pounds of cargo. The Americans relied on industrial might, flying hundreds of sorties, burning thousands of gallons of aviation fuel to drop pallets of sea rations and ammunition. The North Vietnamese relied on human endurance. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a triumph of willpower over technology. Tens of thousands of civilian porters, known as the Dan Kong, utilized heavily modified bicycles to transport supplies. By reinforcing the frame with bamboo and extending the handlebars, a single person pushing a bicycle could transport up to 400 pounds of cargo through narrow jungle tracks that were completely invisible to American reconnaissance planes. They moved at night under the thick jungle canopy, enduring malaria, tigers, and relentless American bombing. While Westmoreland looked at his spreadsheets, calculating tonnage dropped by aircraft, Giap knew that his army of ants was steadily building a mountain of ammunition right on the Marines' doorstep. The environment itself was a combatant, and it favoured the attackers. Khe Sanh sat on a plateau of red laterite clay. During the dry season, the movement of trucks and helicopters kicked up a blinding, choking red dust that coated weapons, jammed rifle bolts, and ruined aircraft engines. But as January approached, the northeast monsoon season began. The temperature plummeted. A thick, impenetrable fog rolled in from the mountains, and the sky turned into a low ceiling of heavy, grey clouds. This weather phenomenon, known as the Kratchin, grounded American tactical air support for days at a time. The red dust turned into a thick, sticky mud that sucked the boots off men's feet and caused trench walls to collapse. The Marines were forced to live like rats in this subterranean nightmare, constantly digging, constantly repairing, while the unseen enemy rained steel down upon them through the fog. The terrain around the main combat base was dominated by a series of rugged, jungle-covered hills. The Marines knew that if they allowed the NVA to occupy these peaks, the enemy would have a direct line of sight to rain mortars and recoilless rifle fire down onto the airstrip. Therefore, Colonel Lowndes deployed his battalions out into the hills, establishing heavily fortified outposts on Hill 861, Hill 881 North, and Hill 881 South. These hill outposts were isolated islands of American firepower, completely cut off from the main base by land, reliant entirely on helicopter resupply. The men on these hills were the tripwire. They would be the first to feel the full wrath of the North Vietnamese assault. By mid-January 1968, the pieces were set on the board. The Marines were dug in, their artillery registered, their air support on standby. In the surrounding jungle, unseen and unheard, 30,000 North Vietnamese soldiers tightened the noose, their heavy guns loaded, their sappers sharpening their wire cutters. The silence over the plateau was heavy, pregnant with the promise of unprecedented violence. A Marine patrol pushing out into the mist would soon stumble into an ambush. A defector would cross the wire with a terrifying warning, and the sky would suddenly tear open with the scream of incoming rockets, signaling the start of a 77-day descent into hell. The catalyst that ignited the powder keg arrived not with a barrage, but with a single man walking out of the fog. On January 20, a North Vietnamese first lieutenant named La Than Tonc approached the Marine perimeter with a white flag. He was the commanding officer of an anti-aircraft company in the 325th Sea Division, and he brought a chillingly precise intelligence briefing. He laid out the exact timeline, the specific units, and the precise axes of advance for the impending attack. The assault would begin that very night, targeting the hill outposts first, followed by a massive bombardment of the main combat base. Many intelligence officers are naturally skeptical of defectors, wondering if they are planting disinformation to trigger a premature reaction. But when you are sitting in a trench line, surrounded by 30,000 unseen enemies, you do not have the luxury of ignoring a warning that specific. Colonel Lowndes ordered his men to stand to, double the watch, and prepare for the storm. At exactly 05:30 hours on January 21, the sky over the Laotian border flashed a brilliant, violent orange. Seconds later, the ground beneath Khe Sanh began to heave. Hundreds of 122mm rockets and 130mm artillery shells slammed into the red clay of the plateau, turning the American combat base into a chaotic inferno of flying shrapnel and collapsing bunkers. The North Vietnamese gunners had spent months meticulously registering their targets, and their accuracy was devastating. In the opening hours of the bombardment, a heavy enemy shell found the absolute worst possible target on the entire base. It scored a direct hit on the main ammunition dump. The resulting explosion was a cataclysm that defied human comprehension, a localized earthquake that knocked Marines flat on their backs, hundreds of yards away. 1,500 tons of high explosives, artillery shells, mortar rounds, and a ABC went up in landing ball that vaporized the storage facility. To put that into perspective, the sheer kinetic force of that single explosion rivaled the magazine detonation that sank the battleship USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. But the nightmare was just beginning. Stored right next to the high explosives was a massive stockpile of CS tear gas. The shockwave pulverized the gas canisters, sending a dense, suffocating cloud of chemical irritant rolling across the entire base, settling into the trenches and bunkers. How do you orchestrate a complex combined arms defense when your primary stockpile has just been vaporized, your communications wire is shredded, and you literally cannot breathe? The Marines of the 26th Regiment found out the hard way. They were forced to fight, dig, and treat their wounded while wearing the cumbersome M17 protective gas mask. The M17 was a heavy rubber monstrosity that restricted peripheral vision, muffled voices to a garbled grunt, and turned the humid, tropical air into a sweaty sauna against the face. Fighting a modern war is difficult enough, without feeling like you are suffocating in a rubber box. The destruction of the ammo dump meant that 90% of the garrison's artillery shells were gone in an instant. The base was now entirely dependent on an aerial umbilical cord that the North Vietnamese were determined to sever. Simultaneous with the bombardment of the main base, the North Vietnamese infantry launched ferocious ground assaults against the isolated hill outposts. On Hill 861, Kilo Company of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines found themselves locked in a desperate, hand-to-hand struggle in the pitch black. The NVA sappers had utilized Bangalore torpedoes, long metal tubes packed with explosives, to blast gaps in the American concertina wire. Hundreds of North Vietnamese infantrymen poured through the breaches, armed with AK-47s, RPG-7, rocket-propelled grenades, and satchel charges. This environment created a brutal testing ground for the standard-issue infantry weapons of the two armies. The American forces were equipped with the early iterations of the M60A1 rifle. In a sterile testing environment, the M16 was a marvel of modern engineering, firing a high-velocity 5.56mm round that tumbled upon impact, creating devastating wound channels. But Khe Sanh was not sterile. The red laterite clay, turned into a fine abrasive paste by the monsoon moisture, found its way into the tight tolerances of the M16's direct impingement gas system. Without meticulous, constant cleaning, which is nearly impossible during a human wave assault, the M16s began to experience catastrophic failures to extract. Marines were found dead in their fighting holes, frantically trying to clear jammed rifles with cleaning rods. Conversely, the North Vietnamese carried the Soviet-designed AK-47. It was heavier, less accurate at range, and fired a slower 7.62mm round. But the AK-47 was built with loose tolerances and a long-stroke gas piston system that essentially allowed it to chew through mud, sand, and carbon buildup without missing a beat. In the close-quarters trench clearing on Hill 861, the rugged reliability of the AK-47 gave the NVA a distinct, lethal advantage. To counter the human wave tactics, the Marines deployed one of the most bizarre and terrifying vehicles in the American arsenal, the M50 Ontos. The Ontos looked like a steel pyramid on tank treads, and its primary armament was not a single cannon, but 6 106mm recoilless rifles mounted on the outside of the hull. It was originally designed as a lightweight tank destroyer, but its thin armor, barely half an inch thick, made it highly vulnerable to enemy anti-tank weapons. However, in the anti-personnel role at Khe Sanh, it was a weapon of mass destruction. When loaded with beehive rounds, each containing thousands of steel flechettes, a single Ontos could fire all 6 barrels simultaneously, essentially acting as a mechanized, multi-barreled shotgun that could clear an entire tree line of enemy infantry in a split second. The blast-backblast from the recoilless rifles was so violent it would knock the leaves off trees behind the vehicle. The Ontos became the mechanical savior of the Marine perimeter, rushing from sector to plug gaps in the line with a wall of flying steel darts. As the siege dragged into February, the North Vietnamese shifted their tactics from direct assaults to a slow, methodical strangulation. They began to dig, using techniques perfected at Dien Bien Phu. The NVA engineers constructed a vast, complex network of siege trenches that zigzagged their way toward the American wire. They dug primarily at night, camouflaging the excavated dirt to hide the trenches from American reconnaissance aircraft. The geometry of the trenches was calculated to prevent enfilading fire. They never dug in a straight line for more than a few yards. This exact same sapping tactic was used over a century earlier by General Ulysses S. Grant during the Siege of Petersburg in the American Civil War, where Union troops slowly dug their way toward Confederate lines, creating a psychological nightmare for the defenders who could hear the constant, rhythmic sound of shovels scraping against dirt just beyond their sight. To counter this invisible, creeping threat, the American military unleashed a highly classified, futuristic program known as Operation Igloo White. If you cannot see the enemy through the jungle canopy, you have to listen to them. The Air Force dropped thousands of electronic sensors along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the avenues of approach around Khe Sanh. These included akubuis, which were massive microphones designed to hang in the tree branches and listen for the sound of truck engines or human voices, and ADS-IDs, air-delivered seismic intrusion detectors. The ADS-ID was shaped like a giant lawn dart. It was dropped from an aircraft, buried itself deep into the mud, and used a seismic sensor to detect the vibrations of marching feet or rolling tires. These sensors transmitted their data to high-flying relay aircraft, which fed the information to a massive computer center in Thailand. The computers would calculate the speed and direction of the unseen enemy columns, and automatically vector in F-4 Phantom fighter bombers to drop their ordnance on a set of coordinates in the blind? Can a microphone dropped in a jungle canopy really stop a division of hardened infantry? The answer was a bloody paradox. The sensors allowed the Americans to inflict horrific casualties on the NVA staging areas, bringing artillery time on target, or TOT missions down upon the enemy. In a TOT mission, multiple artillery batteries located miles apart coordinate their firing times so that all the shells, flying on different trajectories, impact the exact same target at the exact same split second. The NVA would be walking through a quiet jungle one moment, and in the next millisecond, an entire grid square would cease to exist. Yet, despite this godlike technological overwatch, the North Vietnamese kept digging, kept bleeding, and kept moving forward. The ultimate shock of the siege occurred not at the main base, but several miles to the west, at a small special forces camp called Lang Vây. Defended by a handful of American Green Berets and several hundred indigenous Montagnard fighters, Lang Vây sat directly on Route 9, guarding the western approach to Khe Sanh. On the night of February 6, the defenders heard a sound that chilled them to the bone. It was not the familiar thud of mortars or the crack of rifles. It was the heavy, metallic clanking of tank treads, accompanied by the deep growl of diesel engines. The North Vietnamese had achieved the impossible. They had secretly marched a company of Soviet-supplied PT-76 amphibious light tanks down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, through the rugged mountains, and right up to the wire at Lang Vây. The PT-76 was not a heavily armoured behemoth. It had a maximum armour thickness of only 14 millimeters and carried a relatively small 76 millimeter main gun. But in a theatre where American intelligence firmly believed the enemy possessed absolutely no armoured capability, the psychological impact of these tanks rolling out of the darkness was devastating. It was a localized repetition of the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, where American troops resting in the quiet Ardennes forest were suddenly overrun by German panzer divisions they were told did not exist. The Green Berets at Lang Vây scrambled to defend their perimeter, using the M72 Law, the light anti-tank weapon. The Law was a disposable single-shot, 66 millimeter rocket launcher designed to be carried by a single infantryman. On paper, it was capable of penetrating the thin armor of a PT-76. In the terrifying reality of a night assault, the weapon system failed catastrophically. The humid jungle environment had degraded the firing mechanisms. Green Berets stood up under heavy machine gun fire, aimed their laws at the advancing steel monsters at point-blank range, squeezed the trigger, and heard nothing but a dull click. When the rockets did fire, many failed to detonate upon impact, simply bouncing off the sloping armor of the Soviet tanks. The NVA armor rolled right over the concertina wire, crushing bunkers and firing high-explosive shells point-blank into the American defensive positions. The survivors were forced underground into a heavily reinforced tactical operations center, calling in artillery fire directly onto their own position in a desperate attempt to destroy the tanks sitting on their roof. The fall of Lang Vây proved that the North Vietnamese were willing and able to escalate the conflict to a conventional, mechanized war, and it removed the final buffer between the NVA and the main marine base at Khe Sanh. With Lang Vây gone and the anti-aircraft fire around Khe Sanh becoming a solid wall of lead, the American logistical lifeline was on the verge of snapping. The massive C-130, Hercules transport planes, the workhorses of the airlift, were taking unacceptable losses. The NVA had moved their heavy 12, 7mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns into the surrounding hills. As the slow-moving C-130s approached the runway, they were sitting ducks. Once they touched down on the aluminum matting of the airstrip, NVA mortar teams, who had pre-registered every inch of the runway, would immediately open fire. It was a suicide run. To keep the base from starving, the Air Force had to invent a new, highly dangerous method of delivery called LAPs, the Low-Altitude Parachute Extraction System. Instead of landing, a C-130 would come screaming in over the runway at an altitude of just 5 feet, flying at 130 knots. As the aircraft leveled out inches above the tarmac, the loadmaster would deploy a massive drogue parachute out the open rear ramp. The parachute would catch the wind, violently dragging pallets weighing tens of thousands of pounds out of the back of the aircraft. The pallets would skid down the runway in a shower of sparks and dust, while the pilot immediately jammed the throttles forward and pulled the aircraft back up into the sky before the mortars could find him. It required nerves of steel and absolute precision. One slight miscalculation in altitude or airspeed, and the C-130 would cartwheel into a fireball. Resupplying the isolated hill outposts like Hill 881 South, commanded by the legendary Marine Captain Bill Dabney, required an even more complex, heavily choreographed aerial ballet known as the Super Gaggle. Because the hills were surrounded by heavy enemy anti-aircraft fire, a lone helicopter attempting to drop supplies was a guaranteed casualty. The Super Gaggle involved a massive, synchronized strike package. First, a flight of A-4 Skyhawk attack jets would dive out of the clouds, saturating the NVA anti-aircraft positions with napalm and cluster bombs, creating a temporary wall of fire and smoke. Immediately behind the jets, a swarm of CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters would dive through the smoke, hover for mere seconds to kick out crates of ammunition and water, hook up nets of wounded Marines, and bank violently away before the NVA gunners could recover from the airstrike. It was a terrifying daily routine that kept the men on the hills barely alive. Fighting a war of attrition where water was more valuable than gold, and every inch of ground was paid for in blood. The trenches were creeping closer. The electronic sensors were screaming with the movement of thousands of troops. The artillery duels were shaking the very bedrock of the plateau. The North Vietnamese had successfully isolated the garrison, destroyed their primary ammunition reserve, and overrun their western flank with armor. The trap had been sprung, and the Marines were caught squarely in the jaws of a conventional siege. But General Westmoreland was not looking at the casualty reports. He was looking at the skies, waiting for the weather to clear, preparing to unleash an aerial holocaust that would test the very limits of modern destructive power. When the monsoon clouds finally began to fracture, in mid-February, the full, terrifying weight of the United States industrial war machine fell upon the jungle canopy surrounding the plateau. Operation Niagara was not merely a bombing campaign, it was a localized extinction event. General Westmoreland unleashed the B-52 stratofortresses in a relentless, around-the-clock cycle. To solve the problem of visual targeting through the lingering fog and darkness, the Air Force utilized a highly classified, ground-based radar system known as the MSQ-77 Skyspot. This system allowed radar operators sitting in air-conditioned vans miles away to track the incoming bombers and automatically calculate the exact microsecond to release the payload based on wind speed, altitude, and trajectory. The precision was so absolute that the Marines began calling in arc light strikes dangerously close to their own lines. Standard doctrine dictated a safety buffer of 3,000 meters for a B-52 strike. But as the North Vietnamese trenches crept closer, that buffer was shrunk to 1,000 meters, and eventually, in moments of sheer desperation, to a suicidal 300 meters. Imagine standing in a trench, feeling the earth liquefy beneath your boots, and watching a wall of fire erupt just 3 football fields away, knowing that a slight miscalibration by a computer in a van could wipe your entire battalion off the map. The sheer mathematics of the destruction are difficult to process. During the 77-day siege, American aircraft dropped over 100,000 tons of bombs on the hills and valleys around Khe Sanh. That is roughly equivalent to 5 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs detonated in a 5-square-mile area. The North Vietnamese soldiers caught in this maelstrom endured a psychological and physical hell that defies description. Prisoners of war later recounted the horror of the B-52 strikes, describing how the concussive overpressure would cause blood to run from their ears and noses, and how entire companies of men simply vanished, buried alive in their subterranean tunnel complexes when the massive 750-pound bombs penetrated the earth before detonating. But can you bomb an ideology into submission when the enemy is willing to trade 10 lives for every one of yours? This is the fundamental question that haunts the American experience in Vietnam. The strategy at Khe Sanh was a pure application of attrition warfare, a concept that mirrors the brutal logic of German General Erich von Falkenhayn at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Falkenhayn famously stated his goal was to bleed the French army white by forcing them to defend a point of immense national pride. Westmoreland attempted the exact same strategy in reverse. He used the isolated Marine garrison as bait, a tethered goat designed to draw the North Vietnamese Army out of the shadows and into a concentrated killing zone where American air power could grind them into dust. From a purely statistical standpoint, the meat grinder worked. The North Vietnamese suffered catastrophic casualties, with estimates ranging from 10,000 to 15,000 men killed. essentially gutting 2 elite NVA divisions. Yet, while Westmoreland was fixated on the body count at Khe Sanh, General Nguyen Giap was orchestrating a strategic masterstroke that would change the course of the 20th century. On January 31st, 1968, just 10 days into the siege, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive. Over 80,000 communist troops simultaneously struck more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including the heavily fortified capital of Saigon and the ancient imperial city of Hue. The brilliant deception of Khe Sanh was suddenly laid bare. Giap had successfully used the threat of an American Dien Bien Phu to force Westmoreland to pin down 50,000 US troops, including massive logistical and air assets, in the remote northern mountains. By keeping the American command completely mesmerized by the siege, Giap left the populated coastal and southern regions dangerously exposed. This brings us to a fascinating comparison with one of the most famous sieges in American history, the Battle of the Alamo. President Lyndon B. Johnson treated Khe Sanh exactly like the Alamo, viewing it as a symbol of American resolve that could not be allowed to fall under any circumstances, even forcing his Joint Chiefs to sign a literal blood oath guaranteeing its defense. But the Alamo in 1836, despite being a tactical defeat where every defender died, was a strategic victory because it bought General Sam Houston the vital time needed to organize the Texian army. Khe Sanh was the exact opposite. It was a tactical victory for the Americans, who successfully held the ground and annihilated the attacking force. But it was a massive strategic failure because it bought the enemy the time and the diversion they needed to launch a nationwide offensive that broke the political will of the United States. The logistical and economic asymmetry of this battle is staggering when you analyze the cost of the conflict. The United States fought a multi-billion-dollar mechanized war against an enemy fighting a multi-thousand-dollar agrarian war. A single B-52 sortie cost tens of thousands of dollars in aviation fuel, maintenance, and ordnance. The Americans flew over 2,500 of these sorties, alongside tens of thousands of tactical fighter strikes and airlift missions. Millions of dollars were expended every single day just to keep a few thousand Marines alive on a patch of red dirt. Conversely, the North Vietnamese logistical backbone was the heavily modified bicycle, pushed by a peasant subsisting on a few handfuls of rice a day. The economic burn rate was entirely disproportionate. You can destroy a fleet of bicycles with $1 million bombing raid, but you will bankrupt your own political capital long before the enemy runs out of peasants willing to push the next bicycle down the trail. By late March, the North Vietnamese realized that the element of surprise for the Tet Offensive was gone, and their forces around Khe Sanh were taking unsustainable losses from the relentless aerial bombardment. They began to silently melt back into the Laotian jungle, leaving behind a pulverized moonscape littered with exploded ordnance and shallow graves. The siege was officially broken on April 8, 1968, with the arrival of Operation Pegasus. The 1st Cavalry Division, utilizing their revolutionary airmobile tactics, leapfrogged across the mountains in swarms of UH-1 Huey helicopters, reopening Route 9 and linking up with the battered Marines. This relief effort draws a direct historical parallel to the Siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded by German panzers in the freezing snow, holding the critical road junction until General George S. Patton's Third Army punched through the lines to relieve them. The Marines at Khe Sanh, much like the paratroopers at Bastogne, endured horrific conditions and held the line against overwhelming odds. But there is a bitter, cynical difference in the aftermath. When Patton relieved Bastogne, the Allies used it as a springboard to push into Germany and win the war. When the 1st Cavalry relieved Khe Sanh, the American High Command looked at the devastated base, looked at the shifting political winds in Washington, and made a decision that felt like a betrayal to every man who had bled in that red clay. In June 1968, just weeks after the siege was broken and the enemy was driven off, the United States military quietly initiated Operation Charlie. The objective was the complete systematic destruction and abandonment of the Khe Sanh combat base. The bulldozers were brought in to fill the trenches. The bunkers were blown up, and the aluminum runway matting was ripped out of the ground. The very piece of terrain that President Johnson had deemed vital to national security, the fortress that cost the lives of hundreds of Americans and thousands of Vietnamese, was simply handed back to the jungle. The psychological impact of this abandonment on the American public and the troops on the ground was devastating. If a piece of ground is so vital that you are willing to unleash the greatest concentration of conventional firepower in human history to defend it, how can it suddenly be tactically irrelevant a month later? This contradiction exposed the fatal flaw in the American strategy of attrition. In a war without front lines, where success is measured by the macabre accounting of body counts rather than territory held, ground has no inherent value. Khe Sanh was never about holding a plateau. It was simply a designated slaughterhouse. But when the American public watched the evening news, anchored by trusted figures like Walter Cronkite, and saw the Marines fighting a desperate, filthy war for a base that was ultimately abandoned, the illusion of impending victory was shattered forever. So, was Khe Sanh America's Dien Bien Phu, or was it a brilliant trap? The cold, historical truth is that it was neither, and it was both. It was not Dien Bien Phu, because the American military possessed a logistical and aerial capability that the French in 1954 could not even fathom, preventing the garrison from being overrun. It was not a brilliant American trap, because General Giap willingly fed his troops into the meat grinder to successfully blind the American command to the impending Tet offensive. Khe Sanh stands as a grim monument to the ultimate paradox of modern warfare, proving that you can win every single tactical engagement, drop more bombs than were used in the entirety of the Second World War, Annihilate the enemy's frontline formations, and still comprehensively lose the broader strategic and political war. In the end, the blood soaked into the red clay of Khe Sanh whispers a timeless warning to any superpower that believes technology and firepower can overcome the sheer, grinding willpower of a nation fighting for its own soil. Do you believe the Battle of Khe Sanh was A. a successful use of overwhelming American firepower to destroy the enemy, B. a brilliant strategic diversion by General Giap to enable the Tet offensive, or C. a pointless, tragic meat grinder that achieved absolutely nothing for either side? Drop your answer in the comments below.